This video deals with moving across an enemy element's front and clarifies how that rule will be interpreted at CanCon 2025. The rule provides that no element can cross the front of or retire from in front of any enemy element at or closer than one element base width. The exceptions to this are that there are A. Intervening elements, B. Intervening fortifications, or C. Intervening water. With respect to the first exception, what is an intervening element? Well, there is no rules definition as to what is intervening. For CanCon 2025, we are interpreting it to mean that the intervening element must be at least partly between your element and the enemy element. See this example where an element has wholly intervened so that another friendly element can move behind it. Here is a different scenario where the friendly element only partly intervenes. Again, the element behind can move because it is not crossing an enemy's element's front. Here is an example of water partly intervening between your element and an enemy element. In this example, the stationary enemy group is moving through a river. A player can move their elements across the front of this group because there is water intervening. That includes the end element, who is partially on the bank and partially in the river. The same logic applies to fortifications. In this respect, remember, fortifications can be permanent or temporary. An example of fortifications partly intervening is depicted in this example. To clarify, obstacles, whether they be portable or fixed, do not count as fortifications. Part of the rules about moving across an enemy element's front refers to the words "or having done so." Those words for CanCon 2025 are referring to outcome moves, which include flee moves, recoils, pressing forward, follow-up moves, pursuers, or routers that move across an enemy element's front as part of a compelled or reactionary move. In other words, if one of those types of moves results in an element moving across the front of an enemy and it stops whilst doing so, it cannot then continue moving that way of its own prerogative. So, in a nutshell, there is a zone of 6 centimetres that extrudes from the front of an enemy base that you cannot simply cross or slide past. It is colloquially known as the zone of death or the zone of control. Exceptions to moving across an enemy element's front where there is no intervening element, fortification or water include to advance directly forward towards such an element, any part of which is directly in front. This exception means that the enemy element has to be in front of your element. Advancing directly forwards for CanCon 25 means advancing straight ahead directly to your front. The next exception is to advance to line up directly opposite such an element's front. The word directly in this exception moves from advancing to lining up. Directly opposite for CanCon 2025 means that the moving element's front edge is parallel with the enemy element's front edge. If lining up as a group as opposed to a single element, such a group can move up to half a base width sideways to line up. This counts as advancing. Whilst there is no sideways movement rule for single elements, for CanCon 2025, we are counting sideways movement as advancing for them as well. The third exception is to advance its front edge to contact the front edge or front corner only of whichever such enemy element can be so contacted by the shortest move. An element attempting to contact from opposite a join between two enemy elements must thus contact that it initially overlaps most. This exception is how elements move into combat. In this respect, the actual heading in the rules about moving into combat and what follows thereafter really deals with restrictions and the result of moving in. The effect of the third exception is that when you are moving an element with the intent of getting into combat, once it enters the 6 centimetre zone of control, it must contact an enemy element by the shortest move distance. That means that many, if not most, wheels or sliding have to be done prior to being closer than 6 centimetres. In this example, the Mongol player cannot slide their elements into contact with the Chinese archers, even though the distance is okay. This is because some of the elements start within 6 centimetres, and having done so, must contact enemy elements by the shortest move. The shortest move to move into contact or combat is almost always going to be straight ahead, unless there is an intervening element. Remember, it is the shortest move for all corners of an element, not the shortest distance between the front edges, by way of example. In this example, an element attempting to contact from opposite a join between two enemy elements must thus contact it that it initially overlaps the most. This is because the elements are the same distance away. The fourth exception is to follow behind an element contiguously with its front that is moving in accordance with one of the 3 previous exceptions. An example of this is the pike block shown. A knight is sitting next to the pike block and within 6 centimetres. The pikes have an enemy element to their front, which recoiled last turn. Can they move in? The first pikeman can, and the second pikeman can because the first can. The third pikeman is not within 6 centimetres of the enemy element to their front. The second pikeman only got to move across the front of the knight because the first pikeman was advancing its front edge to contact the front edge of the enemy element by the shortest move. The third pikeman does not enjoy that exception. If the third pikeman moved forward, it would cross the enemy knight's front, so it can only retire directly to its own rear, or advance to line up, or advance its front edge to contact the enemy knight. It cannot move directly forward because it would not be moving towards such an element. The take-home message from this example, then, is not to let knights shadow the side of your pike blocks. The last 2 exceptions to moving across the front of an enemy element are to retire directly to its own initial rear without ending in edge contact with enemy, and as an outcome move. These exceptions are self-explanatory, though it should be noted that when retiring, a player may contact an enemy base with a corner of its own base. It can also end facing in the opposite direction, that is, backwards. An outcome move are those that are compelled or reactionary movements, including pursuing, routing, following up, fleeing, pressing forward, or recoiling. We hope that makes everything clear as mud, which is another place that your pike blocks should probably avoid.